My wife's father called me worthless trash in front of the entire family. "She deserves better," he declared. I nodded politely and said, "You're right, sir," and left his house alone. The next day, at 10 a.m., he got 3 text messages. One from his lawyer: "The deal is over. My daughter deserves better. My name is Samuel Hayes and I'm 37 years old. I've spent the last 12 years building a private equity firm in Denver, Colorado, making investments that most people never see coming. I work through shell companies, anonymous trusts, holding firms that keep my name buried in paperwork so deep that even the smartest lawyers take months to trace it back to me. That's how I like it. Clean, invisible, powerful." But right now, standing in my father-in-law's kitchen, watching him wave his coffee mug around like he's conducting an orchestra of insults, I felt anything but powerful. Robert Kellerman had been calling me worthless for 3 years straight. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time I walked through his front door. "She could have married Dr. Patterson's son." He continued, gesturing toward my wife Elena. "But no, she picked you. A man who won't even tell us what he really does for a living." Elena sat at the breakfast table, stirring her eggs around her plate. She never looked up, never said a word, just kept stirring those damn eggs like they held the answer to everything wrong with our marriage. "Samuel works in finance, Dad," she finally mumbled, still not meeting my eyes. "Finance," Robert scoffed. "You know what that means? Nothing. Could be selling insurance for all we know. Could be managing other people's retirement accounts at some strip mall office." I watched him pace around his granite kitchen island, his face getting redder with each lap. This was Robert Kellerman, founder and chief executive officer of Nexora Labs, a struggling biotech company that hadn't turned a real profit in 4 years. He'd inherited money from his father's construction business, and thought that made him some kind of financial genius. What Robert didn't know was that I'd been tracking his company's financial statements for 8 months. Nexora Labs was hemorrhaging cash, burning through what little venture funding they had left. They needed a miracle. They needed exactly the kind of anonymous investor that I specialized in being. "You sit there like a mute," Robert said, pointing his finger at my chest. "Real men speak up. Real men defend themselves." I nodded slowly. "You're right, Mr. Kellerman." The kitchen went quiet. Elena finally looked up from her plate, confusion written across her face. Even Robert seemed surprised by my response. "I am right," he said, his voice uncertain now. "Absolutely," I said, standing up and reaching for my jacket. "Elena does deserve better." I walked toward the front door, feeling their eyes on my back. As I reached for the handle, I heard Elena's chair scrape against the floor. "Samuel, wait." But I was already outside, breathing the cold November air, knowing that everything was about to change. I met Elena 5 years ago at a conference in Boulder. She was presenting research on gene therapy applications, brilliant and passionate about her work at a small biotech firm. I was there because I'd been considering investments in the medical technology sector. What I didn't expect was to fall for the presenter. Our relationship moved fast, too fast probably. Within 18 months we were married in a small ceremony that her father complained about for weeks. He wanted something bigger, more expensive, something that would impress his country club friends. But Elena and I preferred simple things, or so I thought. The problem started during our first Christmas as a married couple. Robert had too much wine, and began interrogating me about my work. I gave him the same vague answers I gave everyone. Private investments, portfolio management, consulting for high net worth individuals, all technically true, but missing the crucial detail that I was the high net worth individual. My company, Amberlin Ventures, managed over $200 million in assets. We specialized in early-stage investments in technology and medical companies, the kind of deals that required discretion and anonymity. I'd built my reputation by staying invisible, letting other people take credit while I quietly collected returns that most investors could only dream about. But Robert interpreted my discretion as weakness. He started making comments about my mystery job and how a real man would be more transparent about his career. Elena would change the subject or laugh it off, but she never told him to stop, never stood up for me. The verbal attacks escalated over the following months. Robert would make snide remarks about my clothes, my car, my lack of ambition. He'd compare me to other men in their social circle, successful doctors and lawyers who drove expensive cars and talked loudly about their achievements. What made it worse was watching Elena shrink during these confrontations. The confident scientist I'd married became quiet and apologetic, constantly making excuses for her father's behavior. She'd pull me aside after particularly brutal dinners and whisper apologies, promising it would get better, but she never confronted him directly. 3 months ago, I discovered something that changed everything. While researching potential investments, I came across Nexora Labs funding documents. The company was in serious trouble, burning through cash faster than they could raise it. They'd approached dozens of venture capital firms, but their debt-to-revenue ratio scared away most serious investors. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could help save Robert's company through an anonymous investment, or I could let it fail. The businessman in me saw the potential upside. The son-in-law in me saw something else entirely. I started the due diligence process, keeping my identity buried behind layers of corporate structure. Robert would never know that his salvation was sitting at his dinner table, listening to his insults, watching his daughter stay silent. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during Elena's birthday dinner. We were at Robert's house, and he'd invited his brother-in-law Harold, a cardiac surgeon who loved talking about his vacation home in Aspen. Harold just bought a new boat. Robert announced as Elena cut her cake. 40-foot yacht. Cost him more than most people make in 5 years. Harold laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. What about you, Samuel? Any big purchases lately? New car, investment property? I should have seen it coming. Robert's eyes lit up with that familiar gleam that meant he was about to go in for the kill. Samuel doesn't make those kinds of purchases, Robert said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He's more of a practical man. Aren't you, Samuel? Elena squeezed my hand under the table, a warning to stay calm, but Robert wasn't finished. I mean, let's be honest here. My daughter is a brilliant scientist. She's published in major journals, speaks at international conferences. She could have married anyone, a doctor, a lawyer, someone with real prospects. Instead, she settled for her. He gestured vaguely in my direction. Well, we all make mistakes. The room went silent. Elena's hand went limp in mine. Harold stared at his cake like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen, and Robert sat there with a satisfied smile waiting for my reaction. I looked at Elena, really looked at her. She was staring at her lap. Her face flushed with embarrassment. Not embarrassment for her father's behavior, but embarrassment for me. For being married to someone her father considered beneath her. That's when I understood. This wasn't going to get better. Elena wasn't going to stand up for me because deep down, she agreed with him. Maybe not completely, but enough to stay silent, enough to let him tear me down in front of her family. I stood up slowly, placed my napkin on the table, and looked directly at Robert. You're absolutely right, I said. She does deserve better. I kissed Elena on the forehead, grabbed my coat, and walked out. Behind me I heard Elena calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I had work to do. The drive home gave me time to think. For months I'd been preparing investment documents for Nexora Labs, a $15 million funding package that would save Robert's company and secure his retirement. The paperwork was ready. All it needed was my signature. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for 10 minutes and made my decision. I wasn't going to sign those documents. In fact, I was going to do something much more satisfying. I was going to let Robert Kellerman learn exactly what it felt like to need someone he considered worthless. The next morning I called my lawyer James Morrison, and asked him to draft 3 documents, a formal withdrawal of investment interest in Nexora Labs, a notice of contract termination for the pending funding agreement, and a confidentiality release that would allow me to reveal my identity as the anonymous investor. Are you sure about this, Samuel? James asked during our meeting. You've spent months on the due diligence. The investment fundamentals are sound despite the family politics. I'm sure, I said. Sometimes the best investment is the one you don't make. By noon I had everything I needed. James would deliver the withdrawal notice to Nexora Labs at exactly 10 a.m. the following morning. I wanted Robert to have a full day to panic before he understood what had happened. That evening, Elena came home around 8 p.m. She'd been staying at her sister's house since the birthday dinner, and I could tell from her posture that she'd been crying. We need to talk, she said, settling into the chair across from me in our living room. Okay. My dad called me today. He's worried that he went too far the other night. I almost laughed. Worried? He wants to apologize. Maybe we could have dinner this weekend. Just the 3 of us. Start over. I studied her face, looking for any sign that she understood what had really happened. But Elena was still thinking this was about hurt feelings and wounded pride. She had no idea that her father had just insulted the one person who could save his company. Elena, I said carefully, how long have you been ashamed of me? The question caught her off guard. What? I'm not ashamed. You've never once told your father to stop insulting me, Not once in 3 years. He doesn't mean it. He's just protective. He called me worthless trash in front of your entire family. You said nothing. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what to say. He gets so angry when people confront him. So you chose his comfort over my dignity. That's not fair. But it was fair, and we both knew it. Elena had made her choice long ago. Every time she stayed silent, every time she made excuses for his behavior, she was choosing her father over her husband. I love you, she said, which somehow made it worse. I know you do. But love isn't enough when you won't fight for it. She left an hour later and I knew she wouldn't be coming back. Not really. Even if we stayed married, even if we went to counseling and worked through our problems, there would always be a part of her that saw me through her father's eyes. The next morning I woke up early and drove to my office. At exactly 10 a.m., I called James to confirm that the withdrawal notice had been delivered to Nexora Labs. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Samuel. Elena's voice was shaky. Something's happened. Dad's company just lost their major investor. $15 million. He's completely falling apart. I'm sorry to hear that. The lawyers won't tell him who pulled out. They said it was an anonymous investment group, but now they're claiming breach of confidentiality terms. Dad's talking about bankruptcy. I stayed quiet, listening to her breathing on the other end of the line. Samuel, I know you work in finance. Do you think, could you maybe ask around, see if anyone knows anything about this investment group? The irony was almost too perfect. She was asking me to help find the investor who could save her father, not knowing that she was talking to him. I'll see what I can do, I said. After I hung up, I drafted 2 text messages and scheduled them to be sent the following morning. The first would go to Elena. The second would go to Robert. Both would arrive at exactly 10 a.m., along with a third message from James Morrison. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone would know exactly who they'd been dealing with. That evening I went through the Nexora Labs files one more time. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about Robert Kellerman's business acumen. The company had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, ever since a failed product launch that Robert had insisted on pushing through despite warnings from his research team. He'd overruled his own scientists, convinced that his business instincts were superior to their technical expertise. The resulting disaster had cost Nexora Labs their partnership with 2 major pharmaceutical companies, and nearly $3 million in development costs. But instead of accepting responsibility, Robert had blamed the research team, fired 3 senior scientists, and started shopping for new investors to bail him out. What made it worse was that Elena had been one of the scientists who'd opposed the launch. She'd written a detailed memo explaining why the product wasn't ready for market, but Robert had dismissed her concerns as typical overcaution from academic researchers when the launch failed exactly as she'd predicted. He'd made her life so miserable that she'd eventually quit and found work at a smaller firm. Elena had never told me the full story. She'd mentioned that she'd had some disagreements with her father about research priorities, but she'd framed it as a difference of opinion rather than what it really was: Robert's arrogance destroying sound scientific judgment. I called Elena's former colleague Dr. Patricia Webb, who'd left Nexora Labs around the same time as Elena. Patricia and I had met at several industry conferences, and she'd always been candid about the challenges of working in biotech. Patricia, this is Samuel Hayes, Elena's husband. I hope you don't mind me calling. Samuel, of course not. How's Elena doing? She's fine. I'm actually calling about something else. I'm researching Nexora Labs for a potential investment, and I wanted to get your perspective on their research capabilities. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Samuel, can I speak freely? Please. Robert Kellerman is a disaster, brilliant scientists, solid research foundation, but the man has no business running a biotech company. He treats his research staff like factory workers, and makes decisions based on ego rather than data. Can you give me an example? The Neurotropan launch. We had 6 months of testing data showing the compound wasn't stable enough for clinical trials. Elena wrote a 20-page analysis explaining exactly why it would fail. Robert ignored it, pushed the launch forward, and lost the company nearly $3 million when the FDA rejected the application. What happened to Elena after that? Robert blamed her for the failure. Said she was being negative and uncommitted to the company's success. Made her work environment so toxic that she had to leave. Honestly, it broke my heart. Elena is one of the most talented researchers I've ever worked with. After I hung up, I sat in my office until nearly midnight thinking about everything Patricia had told me. Robert hadn't just insulted me at family dinners. He'd destroyed Elena's career because she'd had the courage to tell him the truth about his bad decisions. The $15 million investment I'd been preparing wasn't just going to save his company. It was going to reward him for years of arrogance and poor judgment. It was going to validate his belief that he was always right, even when he was catastrophically wrong. More importantly, it would mean that Elena would never have to choose between her father and her husband. She could keep both relationships intact, never confronting the fact that she'd stayed silent while he tore me down. But now she was going to have to choose. And based on everything I'd learned about Robert Kellerman, I had a feeling I knew which choice she'd make. The next morning, I arrived at my office early and made one final review of the withdrawal documents. Everything was in order. James would deliver the formal termination notice to Nexora Labs at 10 a.m. At the same time, my scheduled text messages would be sent to Elena and Robert. At 9:05 a.m. I called Elena. "Samuel, is everything okay? I need to tell you something important, but I want you to sit down first." "You're scaring me." "Elena, I'm the anonymous investor who pulled out of Nexora Labs." Silence. Complete silence for nearly 30 seconds. "What?" "My company, Amberlin Ventures, was prepared to invest $15 million in your father's biotech firm. I withdrew the offer yesterday morning." "That's impossible. You work in portfolio management. You don't have $15 million. "Elena, I own Amberlin Ventures. We manage over $200 million in assets. I've been the anonymous investor. Your father's been courting for 8 months." I could hear her breathing fast and shallow. "This is some kind of joke. Check your phone. You're going to receive a text message in exactly 12 minutes. So is your father. The message will be from me confirming everything I just told you." "Samuel, this doesn't make sense. If you have that kind of money, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't need you to know. And because I wanted to see how your family would treat someone they thought was beneath them." "So this is what? Some kind of test?" "No. It was going to be an investment. Right up until your father called me worthless trash in front of your entire family and you said nothing." Elena started crying. "I should have defended you. I know that. But Samuel, this is my father's life. His company. You can't destroy it because your feelings got hurt. This isn't about my feelings, Elena. It's about respect and consequences. Please don't do this. We can fix things. I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize." It's too late for apologies. At exactly 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text confirmation that both messages had been delivered. Elena's phone buzzed at the same time. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Samuel, please. I'm begging you. Don't destroy my father." "I'm not destroying him, Elena. I'm letting him face the consequences of his own choices." "This is cruel." "What's cruel is watching your husband get torn down for 3 years and never saying a word to stop it." Elena hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Robert, and he was screaming before I even said hello. "You son of a bitch. You think this is funny? You think you can destroy my company because I hurt your feelings? Mr. Kellerman, I think you've misunderstood the situation." "I've misunderstood nothing. Elena told me everything. You're the investor. You're the one who pulled out." "That's correct. 23 people work for me, Samuel. 23 families depend on this company. You're willing to destroy all of them because I said some things you didn't like. Actually, Mr. Kellerman, I'm willing to let your company succeed or fail based on its own merits without my money propping it up. We had a deal. We had a preliminary agreement that I chose not to sign. No laws were broken. No contracts were violated." Robert was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different. Smaller. "What do you want?" "Nothing, Mr. Kellerman. I don't want anything from you. There has to be something. Money and apology." "What?" "I want you to understand what it feels like to need someone you consider worthless." I hung up and turned off my phone. It was over. 3 days later, Elena filed for divorce. She came to the house while I was at work and packed her things, leaving only a letter on the kitchen counter. The letter was 2 pages long, but it boiled down to one simple message. She couldn't be married to someone who would deliberately hurt her family. What she didn't mention was that she'd also cut off all contact with her father. I found out from Patricia Webb, who'd heard it from another former Nexora Labs employee. Elena had confronted Robert about how he'd treated me, and when he'd tried to justify his behavior, she told him exactly what she thought about his business decisions, his treatment of his research staff, and his years of verbal abuse. According to Patricia, the conversation had ended with Elena telling her father that he'd destroyed her marriage and her career, and that she never wanted to see him again. Robert had called her 17 times since then. She hadn't answered once. Within a week, news of Nexara Labs' financial troubles had spread through the biotech community. 2 more potential investors pulled out, spooked by the company's debt ratio and the sudden departure of their lead funding source. Robert was forced to lay off 8 employees and close his secondary research facility. The local business journal ran a story about the company's struggles, focusing on the mysterious withdrawal of their primary investor. Robert refused to comment, but the article quoted several former employees who painted a picture of a company struggling with leadership issues and poor strategic decisions. By the end of the month, Robert had put his house on the market and was liquidating his personal investments to keep the company afloat. The country club membership was gone. The vacation home in Vail was gone. Everything was being sold to buy time. I drove past his house one afternoon and saw him in the front yard, pulling weeds from a garden that his landscaping service used to maintain. He looked older, smaller somehow, like a man who'd finally run out of other people to blame. 6 months later, I received word that Nexara Labs had declared bankruptcy. Robert had managed to find a buyer for some of their research assets, but the company itself was finished. The remaining employees were either laid off or absorbed by the acquiring firm. Robert himself had taken a job as a consultant for a larger biotech company, working out of a small office in a strip mall near the airport. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about success and achievement was now commuting to the kind of anonymous office space he'd once mocked. Eleanor never reached out to me directly, but I heard through mutual friends that she'd taken a position with a research institute in California. She was doing well, publishing papers and speaking at conferences again. She'd found her voice in science even if she'd never found it in our marriage. I sold the house in Denver and moved to Portland, where I opened a new office for Amberlin Ventures. The change of scenery was good for me, and the Pacific Northwest had a thriving tech community that offered plenty of investment opportunities. I never heard from Robert again, but I didn't need to. The business journals kept me updated on his decline. Every failed venture, every missed opportunity, every time someone chose not to invest in his projects because of his reputation for poor decision-making. Robert Kellerman had learned what it meant to be dismissed, ignored, and considered worthless by people who held his future in their hands. He discovered that respect wasn't something you could demand or inherit. It was something you earned through how you treated others, especially when you thought they couldn't fight back. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the natural consequences of their own character. And sometimes the most worthless person in the room turns out to be the one with all the power. Thanks for watching.